what I'm going to explain here is um, the it told the assignment in this chapter said to write a research paper that was 10 pages. It wrote this draft, provided citings in MLA format, and so I'm just going to read over it and summarize what I understand and um, from it having written the paper. So it's okay to use AI to do the writing unless you're told you can't, and that might be for English 101 credit, that you can't use the AI because at that point you have to prove that you can write a research paper. But here, using AI is okay because we're just looking for content here and going to learn from it and then state our own opinions. So I'm going to read over the draft, but it also gave me a full a 10-page copy research paper like that that I will show you. So consent, again, we've talked in this unit about the Moore versus Williams case, which is uh, the medical example of a case um, with consent being if you don't consent and it's operated on the wrong part of you, then that's considered battery, and you could patient could sue for damages. And I've got to say, to add a personal touch to this, I feel like everyone needs to know about tort laws because that's how you defend yourself uh, in like magistrate court if you want to sue for damages $15,000 or less. That's the people's court, and you could potentially do that. I have a statement of claim about that. I fell and broke my iliac, but I didn't know it. Long story short, there was a misdiagnosis. They told me I had cancer and was going to, I was a stage 4 cancer because the radiologist had not known that um, I had potentially had a break. So he thought it was a metastasized cancer from somewhere in my bones and diagnosed me as stage 4 cancer. I'd already seen an oncologist. We were getting ready to start treatment. Thankfully, I didn't have that. I didn't start the treatment. So, and I did not uh, try to bring damages or anything because I hadn't had this treatment. I just said, how about don't charge me anything for your misdiagnosis? That's the way I worked that. So let's look at this, realizing that this could potentially help you or somebody you know somewhere to know what they can do in these situations. So consent, whether it's express or implied, is a foundational doctrine and law serving as a defense to liability in areas ranging from intentional torts to medical malpractice and athletic injuries. So the person who is the defendant could use the fact that you consent um, to a medical practice or a sports event. At its core, consent refers to an individual's voluntary agreement to a particular action or risk, thereby negating wrongfulness or liability. However, the nature, scope, and legal effects of express and implied consent differ significantly, particularly when analyzed across contexts such as medicine and sport. Express consent is communicated directly through spoken or written words and is often required in situations involving invasive procedures or significant risk. In contrast, implied consent is inferred from a person's actions or circumstances as is applied more flexibly, where express agreement is absent but a reasonable inference or acceptance exists. And so this paper analyzes these concepts doctrinally, comparing their application and limitations in medical and sports settings. So the paper looks at the differences between implied and express consent. So in tort law, consent functions as a defense that negates the wrongfulness of what would otherwise be a tortious act. Consent serves as and I didn't know how to pronounce that, by the way. So when you're doing your videos, be sure to look up words that you don't know, sitting on the world of information. Consent serves as a complete defense to intentional torts, such as battery or assault. If a plaintiff voluntarily agreed to the act giving rise to harm, the defendant is not liable because the defendant's conduct is not wrongful under the circumstances. Courts apply an objective standard to assess whether consent was given, whether a reasonable person could conclude consent existed. I had a situation like that with a young woman I knew, met somebody online, went to their house, got drugged there, was raped, and couldn't move, couldn't do anything about it. And whether or not there was anything that she could do legally, um, looking back on it now, although I was concerned about her going to the police and getting further hurt by this individual, I was afraid the police wouldn't support her in this because she did go to the person's house. She did drink what was handed to her, even though her intention was not that. I was afraid that she would get hurt worse and that she wouldn't be supported. So, um, a policeman or detective from that area of town did tell me that yes, even if it's like a prostitute who comes to your house, if they say no, then that's the of course you'd have to have proof that you said no for it to be criminal, right? But if you could prove the others, you could at least try to bring a claim against them for damages, monetary damages. So express consent. Consent occurs when an individual explicitly communicates agreement to an act. In legal terms, this consent can be verbal or written, but its defining feature is that the consent giver has clearly articulated permission for a specific action. For example, a patient signing a consent form before surgery explicitly authorizes the surgical team to perform the procedure. Express consent is strong evidence that the individual understood and voluntarily accepted the action and the risks involved. So that's like if you sign a consent form, that would be express consent. Implied is like what I was talking about, that where somebody voluntarily engages in a sport that may be deemed to have consent to the physical contact, even if they do not sign a consent. Another situation like that, a child plays in a sports event that's not a formal one with the correct age limits and weight limits and protective gear. The parent sends the child willingly there. There's an adult who accidentally injures the child just because they're bigger, right? Playing with the child. This did happen. So the child's like a goalie, and the adult ran into the child, broke the child's elbow, that had to have, and therefore had to have surgery. But even though uh, the parent didn't have to sign a form, they could argue, well, they consented knowing that it was dangerous. So even if the parent did not realize that an adult would be sliding into the parent's child. So so that's a thought there of in real life. So now in modern medical practice, informed consent, an enhanced form of express consent, is a legal an ethical prerequisite for most invasive treatments. Landmark cases such as Canterbury and Spence have established that patients must be informed not just that a procedure will occur, but its material risks, benefits, and alternatives before valid consent is obtained. And if you've ever had surgery or taken drugs for a condition, or even seen commercials, they do state the different risks which can deter you from taking it, but you might also have to sign that at a pharmacy. Not sure. So Canterbury and Spence, the risks. Um, well, one way I could remember that is cantering on a horse is dangerous. Horses are dangerous, especially if you don't know what you're doing. So you could think of that as the risk. It's risky, and maybe link that in your brain that that was the case, where it talked about it, all the different risks to you and benefits. Express consent in medicine usually requires that you sign a consent. And again, if you've had surgery, you've had that experience. Implied consent. Uh, let's see. Cannot a uh, emergency settings when a patient is unconscious or incapacitated and immediate treatment is necessary to prevent death or serious harm. In such cases, the law often presumes consent based on what a reasonable person would choose. However, implied consent in medical contexts is limited and generally applies only to non-elective routine or emergency interventions rather than invasive procedures. Courts have stressed that consent must be valid, not merely assumed. Okay, so you really want to get that, or your a person who has power of attorney to be able to sign in situations of emergency. Doctrinal tension in medical consent centers on balancing patient autonomy with practical needs. While express consent protects autonomy by requiring clear communication of risk and benefit, implied consent accommodations real world exigencies. Is that how you say that? Let's model looking exigencies. So tortious is where I looked this up. Uh, let's look up usage examples. The procedure sued him for breach of contract. Tortious, it's definitely something negative. What is okay, tortious mean? Let's look up tortious meaning. Constituting a tort or wrongful. Tort in French means wrong. Just uh, j'ai tort means I'm wrong. I have tort. Is what you're saying. So exigencies. What does that mean? And how do you say it? So an urgent need or demand. Women worked long hours when the exigencies, let's make sure I'm saying that wrong, of the family. Okay.
Exigencies.
Okay, I've been saying it wrong. Exigencies.
Exigencies.
All right, so I'm just modeling that so you'll see what to do when you make these videos. You want to make sure you're pronouncing it right. So, exigencies. I've been saying it wrong. Sorry about that. Where express consent is unavailable, the debate continues in legal scholarship, with some arguing that courts should impose stricter standards for inferring consent to protect patients' rights. For instance, implied consent should not be broadly applied to justify actions that carry significant risk without explicit dialogue with the patient. So that's up for debate. All right, I'm going to stop with this one. Well, let's read the conclusion. Express and implied consent defenses play crucial roles in limiting liability. In other words, you could argue, well, they agreed to this, maybe like in plastic surgery, too, so the doctor's protected, and argues, well, they knew the risks, but their doctrinal applications differ significantly between medical and sports. Medical law prioritizes express and informed consent. So, and again, if you've had medicine, been to the doctor, you normally have to sign consent, reflecting ethical and legal demands for clear voluntary agreement to risk. Sports law, by contrast, imbues implied consent. Let's look that up. So I think I'm saying it right. Except, but I was mispronouncing. I was mispronouncing the other one.
Imbues.
Okay, that I pronounced right. And what does it mean though? Inspire or permeate. The entire was imbued with sparkle and elan. Okay, so it it's embodied. Implied consent and assumption of risk with central importance, reflecting a societal willingness to accept risk. Although you do often, like anytime you're gonna, like say you're gonna go bungee jumping or maybe even go to the fair. You know, there are fair or some sort of amusement park. There was that young man who went down a slide and was decapitated. So definitely a lot of injuries happened there. So, but for most, the contrast is medical pretty much always requires the express consent, whereas sports events, both contexts illustrate how legal doctrine interprets consent to balance autonomy, risk, and public policy, and both continue to evolve in response to legal scholarship and so that's another characteristic of the consent is that it continues to evolve. The judge is going to look at what the precedents are, but also consider new factors. Understanding these doctrinal contours helps clarify how consent operates to shape legal responsibility. And these were the sources. And here was my generated as a PDF. So it's okay to use it's okay to use AI if it isn't counting for English 101 credit because people use it out in the business world and everywhere else. Medical fields. I went to one of the last doctors I went to. He had AI writing his notes. The last nonprofit meeting I was in, AI was writing the notes. So learning how to use AI is a good thing. Makes you have access to information faster. And if it's not counting for English 101, that's okay here as long as you're presenting it in a way that, oh, here's the download the paper right here. So, and here's my final paper. Uh, but this isn't 10 pages. So, anyway, this is the free chat GPT. But it says, I've expanded the paper. Okay, so this was supposed to be the 10-page paper. I'm not sure what happened here unless why it's not 10 pages. They just did 10 points, it looks like. Oh, okay. Well, my point here was mostly the difference and the contrast. You can elaborate. This is a draft research paper. So we'll look at that later. Right now, what I want you to get out of it is that with medical field, it's mostly always expressed consent that's required to protect the doctor from nurse, the staff from any kind of liability, whereas sports contexts are different and that it is evolving.